Okay, I think we're good to start rolling. Welcome back from lunch. Welcome to session 3, Oral Histories, Memory, and the Teaching of World War II. Remember to keep your video off, and just so that you see the speaker, click those 3 buttons and click Hide Non-Video Participants to make it the best experience for you. You can sign in for session 3 in the document that is being posted right now. Again, feel free to let us know if you missed any of the other sign-in documents, and we'll make sure you get those later. We are so excited to welcome Kristen. Kristen D. Burton is the Teacher Programs and Curriculum Specialist at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. We're so excited to have her here with us today, and you can learn more about her work in the program for today. So Kristen, we will turn it over to you and feel free to take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Shira. And thank you also to everyone over at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for inviting me to speak today to all of the attendees. This is obviously not how we envisioned it happening a year ago, but thankfully technology allows us to connect even in spite of these uncertain times. Thank you all for tuning in today. I'm looking forward to speaking to you in this next hour over teaching with oral histories, which is truly the backbone of the collection at the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans. Now, in the museum, I fill the role of the Teacher Programs and Curriculum Specialist. So I work in the Media and Education Center and fill all kinds of different roles, but primarily I run, facilitate, organize on-site and now virtual teacher programs, while also authoring original curriculum that is available to teachers for free on our classroom website, which I will bring up momentarily. But today we're going to be looking specifically at ways to use oral histories to teach an event like World War II, which is in its scale massive. The history of World War II is one of the largest global events to occur in the history of the world, modern, ancient, or otherwise. The way it affected people across the globe, the number of lives lost due to this conflict, the way lives had to change through something like rationing, or just the sheer fact that there were so many people who had to leave home, many who didn't come back. The scale and scope of World War II is intimidating when it comes to teaching this history to students. And while it happened, 70 to 80 years ago, we've been celebrating the past few years the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the end of the war, and so on. That's living history. There are still people alive, albeit the number is shrinking every day, but that is still living history. And yet to students in the classroom, it feels so far away from our lives today. So how can we close that gap and bring students a little closer to what was one of the most consequential events in modern history? And one of the ways we can do this is through oral histories. This is something that the National World War II Museum has emphasized from its founding. And I do have a bit of a presentation for you, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to bring up this slideshow. And we'll go ahead and get this started. All right. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about oral histories, memory, and the teaching of World War II, as outlined just a moment ago. All right. So the National World War II Museum, as I mentioned, has a very large collection of oral histories, and oral histories was one of the first parts of the collection at the museum. Just a brief history about the National World War II Museum. If anyone has been here or not, hopefully you'll have a chance to visit soon when it is safe in the very near future, fingers crossed. But it was originally founded in the year 2000, opened on June 6th, D-Day, in 2000, and it was founded by 2 historians, Stephen Ambrose and Gordon Nick Mueller, both of them professors at the University of New Orleans. And Stephen Ambrose, Dr. Ambrose, had his own collection of oral histories that he had been using to conduct his own research up to that point. So when the museum opened, it began with a collection of 150 oral histories. These were oral histories Dr. Ambrose, collected via tape recorder, on cassettes primarily audio, very few video, but this was the initial collection of oral histories at the National World War II Museum. Fast forward 3 years, and by an act of Congress, the National D-Day Museum, as it was originally founded, became the National World War II Museum, with a broader focus on the war itself rather than the events around D-Day specifically. Beginning in 2005, the museum launched a new initiative to collect oral histories in a more uniform way. They had specific guidelines, they hired additional staff, and they wanted to make sure that there was a sense of consistency in the collection of these stories. So from that point forward, the museum launched on a mission to collect as many stories as possible. And as you can see on the screen, we now have something in the ballpark of 7,000 oral history accounts. Sadly, it's a small sliver of the stories we could tell in regard to World War II, but it is still something that the museum is continuing to go out as frequently as possible, because we are working against the clock. When the museum was founded 20 years ago, we were dealing with veterans who were primarily in their 80s, some in their 70s. But now the veterans that our oral historians talk to and interview are in their 90s, 100s. And this is a factor when it comes to the collection of oral histories. And it's still, the numbers fluctuate, but the average is we lose about 300 veterans each day. Roughly 300 veterans pass every single day. So we are in a race against the clock to collect as many of these oral histories as we possibly can. But this presents its own unique challenges when it comes to teaching with oral histories. You collect these stories from individuals who experienced something 75, 80 years ago. And that brings in questions of how to incorporate oral histories into teaching, how to deal with the questions around memory when dealing with history. And history is itself a form of memory. And that opens up a number of avenues to engagement with your students and bringing up these questions around critical thinking. So just a brief discussion about oral histories and teaching with them. And then I'll show a few examples from our collection, and we can have a nice little discussion to conclude. So oral histories are a different kind of primary source. They are truly from an individual who lived through an experience. They are a primary source, but there is the complication of time, right? As mentioned before, when someone is recalling an event that happened 75 to 80 years ago, that is a factor in dealing with the telling of the story. And how can we then, as historians and as educators, pass that information on to students in a way that helps them to engage with it in a meaningful but critical way? Now, oral histories, it's important to remember, they're very different from documents. As you all know, documents written on a piece of paper are snapshots in time. These are frozen in the moment in which they were created. Oral histories are created between the interviewer and the interviewee. So there's a dynamic from its outset that frames an oral history from the beginning. But there is power in that voice. And teachers have told me time and time again that they really like using oral histories because it reminds students of the humanity, of the individualism behind these historical events. But just the sheer fact that this is a constructed source guided by an interviewer's questions is important for any analysis that comes afterward. What kind of questions did the interviewer ask? Why did the interviewer ask those questions? This is important when dealing with WPA interviews with individuals who had previously in their life been enslaved. and we're recounting those narratives. The same is true with World War II and talking to individuals who lived through this momentous event. How might they remember them? But what kind of questions does the interviewer ask? And in the World War II Museum's collection, we have many of the oral histories, not all. We are working on that, but a good chunk are available online and they're transcribed. And in the transcription, you will see the questions asked by the interviewer as well. But it does remind students that there are people behind these events. And I think that is one of the most important aspects of using oral histories as a tool in teaching history, reminding students that we are talking about people. Oftentimes with history, students feel like this happened so long ago. What does this have to do with me? It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect my life. My life is so different from what they went through. But when we can incorporate an individual's voice and we just remind students for a moment that we're talking about people, it helps to humanize the past. And at the heart of history is people. I still do some teaching on the side online, but when I teach, I often remind students that to me, history feels like people watching in the past, because the setting in which we operate can be radically different, but people in and of themselves haven't changed that much. And we're motivated by the same things. We share aspirations. Certainly we share certain fears. These are elements that connect people through the centuries. And when we can tell students and show them in specific ways, they are a part of this story. They don't have to care about it. That's up to them. I'm not going to try to convince a student to care about specific moments in the past, but if they can at least walk away and remember that we're talking about people and that they themselves are a part of this same narrative, and that the actions those individuals took affect our lives today, and then therefore, by consequence, the actions we take affect the lives that are to come, we are reminded that we're a part of this larger story of humanity. But it also oral histories open up these discussions about perspectives. And this is one of the most interesting things about historical study and the teaching of history, that a single perspective can change the way we understand an event entirely. We can have an idea of how certain events went. June 6th, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. It was a successful invasion, and it opened up a second front and initiated the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. We have the comfort of saying that because we know that came to pass, but in that moment, we don't know. They didn't know. And I think it's important to take perspectives into consideration, because through an individual story, that moment of the landing on the beaches at Normandy becomes a very different experience. Historical narratives presents it as a success for the Allies, but to be an Allied soldier on that beach, you don't know if you're coming out of that alive. And then looking over and seeing men that you once encountered or engaged with fall, it's harrowing. And in that way, by taking a large event, bringing it down to an individual perspective, the entire narrative can change. And I think there's real value in that. And it helps with teaching these larger events, these massive events that change the course of history, and reminds students of every single individual who helped make that possible. It also encourages the elevation of voices that we may not always think of as being a part of these events, and tells their story, how they contributed to these changes in history and what that experience was like for them. So there's a number of different approaches we can use in dealing with oral histories. They're imperfect sources, as any source may be, but they also present incredible value. And at the heart of it, in teaching with oral histories, students must approach them with critical thinking, with critical analysis, especially when we're talking to veterans 70, 80 years after the fact. How might time factor into their understanding or remembrance of something that they experienced? Now, certain memories will, with individuals, they can remember what they're wearing in that moment. They can recall very specific details because it truly may be an event that marked their mind, and they will never lose that memory. And in some of the oral histories, and one that I will show you in a moment, you can see in their eyes these individuals going back to that moment. And one example I will show in a moment, that comes through. That being said, memory is changing, memory shifts, memories evolve. And this is a factor that is inherent in dealing with oral histories. So at the very least, it will force students to approach every source with a critical eye and help refine those critical thinking skills that rest truly as a bedrock of historical study. Now, before we get to the oral histories, there is a quote I want to share with you all. This is a quote that I include in every single course that I teach. I force students to talk about it. I put it in my syllabus. I make them have discussion board assignments about it, because this is truly one of my favorite quotes. And at least to me, it sums up how I approach the teaching of history. And it's a quote from the historian Christopher Hill. And he wrote this in the book, World Turned Upside Down. And he says, quote, "History has to be rewritten in every generation, because although the past does not change, the present does. Each generation asks new questions of the past and finds new areas of sympathy as it relives different aspects of the experiences of its predecessors." I'm just going to take a minute or two to talk about this quote, because I think it is, at the very least, it generates good critical thinking about how we approach not only our understanding of the past, but how we may teach it as well, but in addition, how students may interact with it, which is why I force my students to talk about this quote. History has to be rewritten in every generation, because although the past does not change, the present does. And one aspect of teaching history is that we're constantly reevaluating the narratives we present. And that is because our understanding of past events changes through the discovery of new documents, primarily new voices and new perspectives. And this gets back to the previous slide, the importance of different perspectives to the teaching of history. So the past is done. The past is, well, like that one quote, it's not even past, but those events occurred. How we understand them, though, is in constant flux. And that is both the value and challenge of teaching history. We gain new perspectives as we uncover and analyze new documents, elevate new voices, come to understand how different people experience the same event. So history has to be rewritten in every generation, because although the past does not change, the present does. And if there's anything history books tells us, they are reflections of the moment in which they are produced. So you can almost learn more about the time in which a history book is made versus the time it's talking about, right? And I think that's one of the more fascinating things about historical inquiry, The curiosity of historians, of history teachers, guides our understanding of narratives. So to the second half of this quote, each generation asks new questions of the past and finds new areas of sympathies as it relives different aspects of the experiences of its predecessors. We're always looking to understand better what happened. And our effort to do so brings forth new understandings, new areas of sympathy as we try to relive different aspects of these experiences of those who came before. And in that way, we do honor their memory, because with such an approach, we make it very clear that the experiences of every individual who came before us is just as important as anyone we may have talked about before. So I just wanted to share that quote with you because I thought it fit really well with this topic of oral histories. But also, it's something that has been something of a guiding light to me in my own approach to history as a discipline, and also in teaching about the past. Now, to get to the more specific stuff, our collection of oral histories at the National World War II Museum, as you saw on one of the early slides, we have something in the ballpark of 7,000 oral histories collected. Several thousand are online. The full collection has not yet been processed and digitized because they do have to transcribe and caption these videos before they go online. But with our classroom website, which this is a screenshot of the home page, it's called From the Collection to the Classroom. And you can access this website at www, the number 2, not II, but www, classroom.org. And on this classroom website, we have 4 different volumes of curriculum focused specifically on social studies. And then we also have an entirely separate volume on STEM curriculum to help teachers cover the history of World War II. And I'm just going to go ahead and get out of this presentation and take you all to the classroom website itself. So let me just minimize this, and I'm going to stop a share, and let me go ahead and share the screen of the classroom website, which I think, if I am correct, is here. Okay. Can you all see the classroom website? Is it sharing correctly? Please let me know. If not, I can adjust. If you can see WW2 Classroom, just give me a little thumbs up in the chat. All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Just want to make sure before we dive in. All right, so this is the classroom website. This is the home page, like the screenshot I just shared in the presentation. And here you will see a number of different links. This is the access to our STEM curriculum. So if there are any science, mathematics, STEM teachers out there, we do have an entirely separate volume dedicated to the teaching of World War II through STEM subjects. We also have 4 different volumes focused on different theaters of the war: Pacific, European, the home front, and then our last volume is Liberation and Legacy, which is specifically dedicated to the end and aftermath of World War II. Each of these volumes includes lesson plans, essays, maps, and any archival imagery that is featured in the gallery that corresponds with this topic in the museum, you will find on the classroom website. I'm actually going to jump real quickly over to the home front, because for Liberation and Legacy, the Liberation Pavilion has not yet been built. It's forthcoming. COVID has put a bit of a hairpin in these things, but if you see for the home front volume, you'll get a better idea of what will become available for the Liberation volume when that pavilion comes into existence. But you can see there's lesson plans, there are essays, nice little who's who, little mini biographies of notable figures, glossaries, statistics related to this specific topic. And then you have a series of essays, and they're written specifically for a grade 7 through 12 audience, and includes outside essays from scholars in the field and people who are specialists and experts in the history of World War II related to the home front, Pacific theater, European theater, and so on. But when we get down here, I'm just going to scroll a bit more, you'll see all these videos. If anyone has ever visited the National World War II Museum, you would have seen these archival films in the galleries. They are also accessible on the World War II www.classroom.org website. And these are nice, usually pretty brief videos that you can show to your students to cover something like the rise of Nazi power here and how it was depicted in global news sources. So there's a number of media assets that correspond to these curriculum volumes. If you go to the Liberation and Legacy curriculum guide, you will notice fewer resources, but they are forthcoming, rest assured. Included in each of these volumes, though, are oral histories. And if you select this little checkbox on the side, you can go directly to the resources you may be interested in accessing. Each curriculum volume features anywhere between 5 to 7 oral histories. They are segments that range anywhere between 6 to 15 minutes. We tried to keep them brief for classroom display. If you wanted to access the full oral history, they are usually between an hour to 2 hours long, but here we specifically did a little snapshots. But for the sake of time, I'm gonna go ahead and just show you a couple clips. The first one, I'm gonna play three minutes. The second one is about 8 minutes long, so I'm gonna try and jump into that so we can have time for discussion. But while you're watching these oral histories, the first one is going to be from Harold Berkman, who was, he fought in the US Army and was one of the liberators at Buchenwald. And he's just going to recall that experience. But I want you to watch how he describes this moment, how he remembers this moment. And then in contrast, I'm gonna show you a clip from a woman named Wanda Damberg, who was imprisoned by the Japanese at San Tomas, I think. I need to double check, but she moved around to a few camps. But she's gonna discuss the experience of being liberated from the camp. And I want you to look at the differences in the way these two individuals tell these stories. So I'm gonna jump into it so we do have time for a few questions and some discussion.
So at any rate, once again, we're moving. We're moving toward Erfurt, and now on the 12th and 13th of April, we're approaching Weimar. And outside of Weimar, we hit the concentration camp, Buchenwald. And this is the first time that the Americans had ever seen a concentration camp. We were one of the first GIs. I was one of the first GIs in Buchenwald. When I walked into Buchenwald, and my company walked into Buchenwald, the ovens were still warm. The inmates were 70 pounds, 75 pounds, undernourished. I saw bones where the furnaces were stacked high, and that's another thing you never forget. Now, Patton saw this, and Patton notified Eisenhower immediately because they had never seen a concentration camp before. And Patton and Eisenhower walked through the concentration camp. Now, the statistics, there were 6 million Jews who were killed, 2 million non-Jewish Poles who were killed. There were 4 million Soviet prisoners who were killed in the concentration camps. There were Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, handicapped people, homosexuals, political prisoners, etc. Now, Patton ordered the Burgermeister of Weimar to assemble some citizens, and they marched them through Buchenwald. The Burgermeister said that he didn't know what was going on at Buchenwald. Now remember, there was black smoke belching from the chimneys 24 hours a day. The stink was terrible, and he claims he didn't know what was going on. The following day, after the Burgermeister after he went through Buchenwald, he and his wife committed suicide. On April the 14th, we got word that President Roosevelt had passed away. And the Germans that we spoke to did not understand our system of government. And they were wondering, what's going to happen to the United States now? There's no President Roosevelt. So we explained that's all taken care of with the Constitution.
Okay, so that's just a brief little clip. Harold Berkman does go on to discuss different events in the war, so I'm going to jump over now to Wanda Danvers' oral history, where she talks about her liberation from being imprisoned by Japanese forces.
Between the barracks were the outhouses, So one morning, I get up to go to the bathroom, and one of the nuns was going. And I was talking to her, and I said, I said, sister, I said, I think maybe the rains are coming. I said, it's so dark, and it's so, and there was noise like thunder. I said, I think the rainy season is, and then all of a sudden, I looked up, and it wasn't thunder, it was 150 Black Widows, the airplanes they called Black Widows, and they were flying overhead, and I looked up, and then this bundle comes out, and I said, oh, apparently it must have been food, because they knew that we were starving to death. Plus, they also had heard that they were going to machine gun and massacre the whole camp. And our commandant then, Kanishi, had very, very frankly spoken to us and said, none of you are going to come out of this camp alive. He hated the Americans, absolutely hated them. So down come, and then pretty soon this bundle has legs. So there were paratroopers, 11th Airborne. And I said to sister, sister, look, they're men. We thought it was food, bundles of food. I said, sister, they're men. Don't they look good? I said, don't they look good? Our men were so emaciated, forget it. These were nice, and sister gave me one. She says to me like that, sister, I said, come on. And I said, look, I said, that guy even has blue eyes. I was kidding her. How did I know? But anyway, so they landed, and they started, they were just all over the place. And they landed in the camp, and of course the Japanese had, they were fighting. They had a little battle right in the camp. And so I'm very interested in seeing all this. So I got into the barracks again, and I went, and I was looking, and where'd they go that way? And, we were telling them. Finally, this paratrooper comes, and he picks up my hair. I had long hair, and he says, lady, get your face in here. He says, do you want to, because they're all these, I don't know what, they're tracer bullets, and you could see them. So I went back to my little cubicle, and Betty Silent, she was there. And Betty had converted to Catholicism. And when she was baptized, the priest gave her a missal. But the Japanese didn't allow books of any kind. So she buried her missal because she wanted it, and she did not want the Japanese to get it. So we were looking at the tracer bullets going right through the barracks, and you could hear them. And I'd say, Betty, here comes another one. And so we'd look, and then we'd see it go out. Well, this one came, and we couldn't find where it had gone. I said, Betty, where'd it go? And she said, I don't know. And with that, she collapses. and it went in her, and blood all over the place, and it went into her back here, and before, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I'm standing there and I'm, help, help. The same guy that told me to get my face back in, he comes and he says to me, lady, didn't I tell you to get away from the bed? And I said, and then I pointed to Betty. Then he saw all this blood and everything. So he says, oh my God. So he says, all right. He picked her up. Maybe she weighed, I only weighed 89 pounds at that time. So she was smaller. So he picked her up like a baby. And he says, lady, you get out of this barracks. And he took off with her. But the last thing she told me, she says, Wanda, get my missile. I didn't know, I knew she had buried it, but I didn't know where. So here I am around her space, I'm digging with my hands, and I couldn't find it, Finally, I found it. And when I got up, the barracks was on fire. And I looked and I couldn't, so I'm, help again, and the same guy comes. And he says, lady, at least he called me lady. Lady, he says, didn't I tell you to get out of this? And I said, yes, but, I couldn't explain to him. He says, all right, he says, we're going to run through the fire. So he takes his helmet and he says, cover up, cover your face. The next thing I know, I'm on his shoulder like a potato sack. And he picks me up like this, and he's running. And he gets to the flames, and he says, all right, cover up. He says, we're going through the flames. Well, me, curiosity plus. So I forget it. I looked, and I burned, my hair was all burnt. Oh, I was a mess. Anyway, down we go. And in the meantime, these amphibious tanks had come around the bend, and I was the last tank was already moving when this paratrooper and I were running down the hill, and he just threw me in, and I land underneath the exhaust pipe of the machine gun. So I didn't know anything about that, so I was just glad I was out of there. And then he jumped in. Well, halfway then we get to the lake. We had to go across the lake where the American troops were. And we get to the lake, I'm thinking we're drowning. Of course, this is amphibious tanks. I didn't know from nothing. And so we get onto the lake. And before we hit the lake, the Japanese are fighting, and they're shooting and all. So this paratrooper says, sorry, he says, I'm going to have to get up there to use the machine gun, which he did. But I didn't know that the casings were coming down this thing, hitting me in the back, and every time it hit, burn, It was a mess. I was a mess. But anyway, I was glad I was out of there. So we get to the other side, and it's like a beach. And they had mobile kitchens. Oh, it was so great. So we get off, and I saw one of the GIs, and I said to him, could I have a cigarette? And he said, oh, sure, ma'am. He gives me a whole carton. And I said, no, I just want one. No, he says, keep it, he says, The GIs couldn't have been nicer. They would do anything for you. So here I am with a carton, and they were old golds, I'll never forget. And I light one up, and I'm like drunk. I take one puff, and I'm going down the beach like this. So Father Ahern is sitting there among those Dominicans, there were 6 Americans. They had picked up all 6. Father Ahern is sitting on a log, and I'm going by, and I'm like drunk. And he says, hey, Wanda, he says, where'd you get the booze? And I said, the booze? I said, here. And I threw him the carton of cigarettes. I said, this is the booze. I said, you can have them. I said, I've never smoked again. Forget it. And so we were on the beach there, and then pretty soon the 6x6s came, and they took mothers and children first, and then and old people, the old men and old women, and then they took us. I was 23 at the time, so then they took the young people.
All right, so those are just two examples of oral histories from the Liberation and Legacy curriculum volume, two very different stories of liberation, one in the European theater, one in the Pacific theater, one from the perspective of a liberator, one from the perspective of someone being liberated. But you also have two very different storytellers, right? So I'm going to just jump right back real quick to my presentation, and we'll wrap this up and open this up for discussion. If I can just very quickly find, let me get my presentation up here. There we go. Didn't want to pop up for a second. Okay, I think we're back in action. Very good. So two very different storytellers, two different oral histories. Again, all of these are accessible for free on the www2classroom.org website. All you have to do is just create an account. The reason why we ask teachers to create an account is because there's certain video and images that are licensed. So to access them, they're behind a paywall, but you know, the paywall is free. But I just thought these were two good examples of the different kind of sources you can deal with when talking about oral histories and dealing with a subject like liberation in World War II. You do get a first-person perspective. And it helps, again, like we were talking about before, humanize something that is so large in scale. World War II is massive. The European theater alone can overtake an entire semester of teaching. But the Pacific is also a massive story and in many ways an entirely separate war, even though it falls under the umbrella term of the same war of World War II. So you can at least bring students down to these moments encountered by individuals. What was that experience like for them? It can help bring detail into your lectures. Your lectures can cover broad narratives, but through these oral histories, you can bring it down to something more specific, more concrete. And students tend to remember these firsthand accounts over large sweeping narratives. And I did want to show you Wanda Danberg's account because one, she's just such a dynamic storyteller, but also she's talking about a harrowing event, but in a way that is oddly entertaining. And through that kind of dynamic presentation, students will remember these events. They can latch onto it because it's something that, one, they'll enjoy seeing, but they'll learn a lot from an individual's perspective. But also, what details did Wanda recall? Very different from Harold Berkman, who had his notes very clearly written down for reference. But finally, this is an opportunity for students to assess how oral histories both supplement and support these larger narratives. And in that way, they become important tools in the telling and teaching of history, the preservation of voices, the elevation of voices, and just reminding students that at the heart of every historical account is an individual who took action and whose actions had consequences, and that their experiences mattered, because our experiences also matter. And the same is true for the people who came before us. And in this picture, I just want to give one quick shout out to one of our now former, sadly, recently passed volunteers, a World War II veteran, Leo Terrebonne, who was just near and dear to all of our hearts at the museum. He passed a few weeks ago and was just a real delight and an incredible storyteller in his own right. I encourage you to look up his oral history. You can access that, and I'll throw it in the chat, but it's www.2online.org. That has the full collection of our oral histories. But he's there showing a picture of him and his first wife, who he met while he was in England, while in service for World War II. And with that, I'm going to conclude. I want to leave time for discussion. And in this discussion, I would love to hear your thoughts about the Harold Berkman and Wanda Danberg oral histories. what ways you've incorporated oral histories into your own teaching, what stood out to you as the presentation went on. But if you also have any questions, I'm happy to answer those as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just stop sharing my screen, and then we can open it up. I believe we have about 15 or so minutes for discussion. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. And I'm happy to talk to you about those. And at the very least, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about Harold and Wanda's oral histories as well. All right, so we got some questions rolling in. Francis asks, are there parts of Japanese internment that compare to the labor camps in Europe? So we deal with, we describe it as Japanese American incarceration at the museum. And we approach that subject full on in our Homefront curriculum. And in that we do discuss, I mean, it's a dynamic subject to be sure, but looking at what that experience was for Japanese American citizens as a unique experience. The fact that we use this terminology of camps tends to lead to a level of conflation with concentration and death camps in Europe. They're very different things. And I think it's important to deal with those contexts in different ways and talk about them for what they were. With Japanese American incarceration, we like to look at the individual experiences, but also what the question of citizenship meant and service. So we have oral histories with individuals who were incarcerated at a number of different camps in America. And I'm going to actually just go right back on my computer real quick. If you see my eyes darting about, it's because I've gone back to the WW2 Classroom website. And I just want to show you all, I won't show the clip to save time and allow time for discussion, but I do want to encourage you all to look at one specific oral history when you have time, and it's Walter Imahara. So Walter Imahara, he was incarcerated, I think at Heart Mountain, but I could be wrong. That may be Norman Mineta, and I may be conflating my oral histories a bit, but his oral history is fantastic because he discusses the fact that his brother was born while his family was incarcerated at this camp. And the officials at the camp didn't know what to put on the birth certificate. And his parents are like, born in the United States, is an American, but they didn't know. They didn't know how to fill that out. So they wrestled with this idea of citizenship. In addition to Walter Imahara's oral history, also he is local to Louisiana and has, he's based in the Baton Rouge area. And it's just an incredible individual and just a very dear individual who we hold close to our hearts. But in addition, I also want to show you some of the teaching aids and videos that go with this curriculum volume, glimpses of life in the camps. And then also we have these what would you do scenario videos. And this is a question around Japanese and American incarceration. In these videos, it presents a real scenario, real life individuals. And there's really no right or wrong answer. So for this particular video, the question is, you and your family, being Japanese American, Americans of Japanese descent, are incarcerated. And then you as an individual who is of age, a young male who's of age, is asked to enlist in the military. What do you do? Do you serve your country, or do you intentionally avoid being drafted, right? And these videos are popular because they open up avenues of discussion for students, and then the video will conclude by sharing what actually happened. For that video in particular, it's a broader, it takes overall the number of Japanese American citizens who did decide to serve versus who didn't. But a lot of those what would you do scenario videos take individual stories, and they open up good avenues for classroom discussion and videos that are usually about 10 minutes in length or less. Let me just scroll back up here so I can get to the questions. Does the site have lesson plans linked to specific videos? The lesson plans will have a box where it will list any corresponding videos that goes with that lesson plan. It'll say, you know, media assets, online classroom resources, and it will say reference this specific video, which you'll be able to find on the website. So anytime a lesson plan does incorporate an oral history or any other videos available on the classroom website, it will mention that specifically so you can bring it up. And also on the classroom website, when you create an account, you can save specific lesson plans, videos, and maps to what is called My Classroom. So you can access that, and everything you need for a day is boom, right there. You don't have to go searching. Really enjoyed the interviews. Yeah, I mean, the stories are absolutely incredible, and listening through some of these oral histories, I know when, and just this is anecdotal on my part, but when the COVID shutdown was first coming through and we were all wrestling with this stark change and dramatic change to our daily lives, I looked at a lot of home front videos, oral histories, where people were talking about how their lives changed because of the war, and it brought a form of comfort in its own way. As far as oral histories, when should they be recorded? Should events be captured in the moment, so to speak, or should some time pass to assess the historical significance of the event? That's a really good question. And honestly, there's not a clear answer to this, because when you allow the passage of time, people can speak about things differently when they acknowledge this is a moment of significance. When you're living through something, you may not fully understand or appreciate how important it is to the overall scope and path of time, right? And historical narrative. I think the present moment we're living in is testament to that. I think at this point, we've all come to the conclusion 2020 is a historical year for a litany of reasons. But when COVID was first happening and shutdowns were first occurring, I remember, for example, my brother called me and he said, "Okay, historian, tell me straight, right? Is this a big deal? What's happening right now?" And I was like, "Absolutely. This is, I mean, entire nations are shutting down. This is going to be an incredibly important moment, but it's not always perceptible when you're living through it." So that passage of time can affect the way people tell these stories. And so there's really not a right or wrong answer to, is it better to capture them in the moment versus after the fact? You may get very different accounts, but the differences in those accounts have their value, right? And reminding students of that passage of time is also valuable to their own critical assessment of what they're listening to. So in any way that you can incorporate these first person perspectives, you can bring in valuable points of understanding and interpretation, whether it be immediate or with some time. Now, as time passes, as we discussed before, memory becomes more volatile and it may become less reliable. That's also another factor. And so it's a murky answer to a very good but complicated question. But there's value in each of these voices at any point in which they're recorded. It's just a question of how you approach them. That short answer or long answer to a short question. Let's see here. Wanda's reaction with her description of blood all over struck me as how people who lived through Katrina described the destruction as just a part of everyday life and recovery. Yeah, that's something about Wanda's oral history that stands out to me too, and I'm glad you mentioned that and mentioned that in the chat. Thank you for bringing that up. It's almost cavalier the way Wanda Danberg discusses her moment of liberation. not, and I'm not saying that that is a bad thing by any means. Like that is, it's unique because you don't often encounter stories of liberation where people are just describing, she's describing the death of her roommate in the camp. And it's one of those things where it's like, how do people process these moments? How do they categorize them in their own mind? The kind of details that she latches onto and talks about at length, like smoking a cigarette and how it made her drunk. She talks about that at length. But a moment of trauma and horror, like seeing her roommate get shot and killed, she kind of glosses over in a way, and that could also speak to how she's had to live with those memories, right? And that's another way of engaging with memory in these oral histories. How do people talk about these moments? And one really interesting thing that we've heard time and time again at the World War II Museum is World War II veterans who didn't think that their stories were of value to share. A lot of them didn't want to talk about what happened, not just because they may have not wanted to relive it, but a lot of them didn't think, no, people aren't going to be interested in this. We've heard that so many times, that people who live through this moment don't think that their stories have value. And we hear it from home front workers as much as we hear it from individuals who served abroad. And it's this kind of reminder of how we categorize these things in our mind, and we assign value inherently within ourselves. And by doing so, we may determine whether or not we want to share something, but also in choosing to or to not share something is a form of coping in its own way. Do you have any recommendations of how to interview people when it's not safe to be in person? So this will be the last question because we're quickly running out of time. I will say there are great guidelines. There's a lot of oral history associations who posted guidelines post-COVID to address this question specifically. Always, if you can get in contact with someone who knows a veteran, who understands Zoom, Google Meet, or any other video conferencing software, I think it would be good to work through a mediary. However, that being said, the Oral History Association has addressed this, and there's a lot of different websites with guidelines online to deal with how to conduct these interviews in a way that is safe, given the ongoing COVID pandemic. Thank you all for your questions. Many thanks to the folks at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And I just want to thank you all for tuning in today to talk to or listen and talk to me about these oral histories. I hope you all continue to stay safe and take care. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristen. We are so excited that you were able to be a part of this today. Here we are. So what's going to happen now is we are going to post the link into the chat. To make sure that people have all signed in for session 3. I think pretty much all of you have. And let's see. Yes, but I think we're all excited to think about how we can bring more oral histories into our class, whether it's things going on now that you want your students to look to people to learn more about, or definitely World War II and other things in the past. Is there any? Nope, I think everybody is just thanking you in the comments. I don't think we have any outstanding questions. Remember to sign in for session 3. Do we have that link? Somebody will throw that link in, and then also we're going to post the link for the next session. The next session begins at 1:30, so you have a little bit of time to stretch your legs, but we will post both of those links in here before everybody heads out. But thank you again, and we will see everybody soon. And thank you again to Kristen.
Hey, thank you, Shira. I appreciate it.
Okay.